This episode of Behind the Regs is sponsored by Plan Checker. Plan Checker is a UK-based digital platform designed to connect clients with verified building control and construction professionals, making it easier to find the right expertise at the right time for the right job. It doesn't replace building control bodies, and it doesn't carry out restricted activities or function. It simply creates clearer, more transparent access to the professionals working across the industry. If you're a professional, a client, or part of the wider built environment sector, you can learn more or sign up at planchecker.co.uk. Welcome to Behind the Regs, the podcast where we explore what really sits behind building safety, regulation, and professional judgment across the built environment. Today, with my co-host Jack, we're joined by Dr. Michael Kinsey, a chartered fire engineer, associate director, and a researcher specializing in human behavior in fire and evacuation modeling. It's great to have you with us, Michael. Your work is at the intersection of fire engineering, research, and real-world design, with a particular focus on how people actually behave in emergencies. So, before we get into the detail, can you give our listeners a brief overview of your background and how you came to specialize in human behavior and evacuation modeling?
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. So a bit about me. My major at university for a degree was in computer science, and I was always planning to go into software engineering and actually specifically information security, cryptography, because I was very interested in that. And I was asked if I wanted to do a PhD at the end of my degree at the Fire Safety Engineering Group at the University of Greenwich, specializing in looking at how people behave in fires and developing computational models to represent the process. And I didn't really know much about it, to be honest, but I thought, oh, that sounds interesting, and the opportunity to get funding for a PhD was quite appealing. So I embarked on a PhD. I actually left the first PhD originally and then came back to start another one at the group. But yeah, I completed a PhD which focused on looking at how people behave on and around lifts and how can we use lifts or elevators to support full building evacuation. And I developed computational models. We tried to understand a bit about how people might behave on and around evacuation lifts during fires. We also looked at how people would behave on and around escalators. So it was vertical transport, very much a common theme. And then I did a postdoc afterwards, which continued a lot of the work in my PhD. I then went to work as a fire engineer at Arup Fire, and I spent 10 years, about 10 years with Arup Fire. And that was initially in London, and then I moved to Shanghai in China, and then I moved back to the UK, and then and now currently I'm working for a fire engineering firm called Ashton Fire, and yeah, my role is very much practicing fire engineer, but very interested and have expertise in human behavior in fire. And throughout my fire engineering career, I've always been involved in fire engineering research focused around looking at human behavior in fire and evacuation modeling. And I find it really fascinating as a topic because most of engineering, certainly the research, is focused on the things that you can control, maybe the structures, the systems, what have you. Whereas human behavior is something we try to understand and then decide, well, what can we do with the design given what we know about the human behavior? So I'm particularly interested in decision making, how people make decisions, how they behave as groups, and how they communicate, and things like that. So that's a bit of a summary of my background and experience.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Michael. That gives a good, clear background for yourself. I think some of the questions which we'll have will delve into a lot of different sort of aspects, but to kick us off, a lot of fire safety design is built around assumptions of orderly, rational behavior. From your experience, how different is real human behavior in fire situations compared to what designers may expect?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and probably the first thing to perhaps state is that there's no formal documentation about how humans are assumed to behave based on the guidance. Fire design guidance typically says you need XYZ, but it doesn't say what's the assumption that's predicated on. So one of the issues we have is that that puts onus on the practitioner using the guidance to infer an assumption. And that could be inconsistent between practitioners, which creates a potential challenge, because if two practitioners assume different things, you could come up with different designs, and both be valid if they're based on different assumptions. But this said, we have done some research trying to tease out some of the potential assumptions in fire design guidance, and we did a very broad survey focused on assumptions about human behavior, not assumptions about fire dynamics, although there are those as well. And we tried to tease out what assumptions are sometimes required versus what some assumptions are always required. And they include things like the concept that if I put an alarm and the alarm activates, I'm assuming people will have the ability to hear it, and I'm assuming they'll know what to do, and I'm assuming they will do what I want them to do, which is classically start evacuating without delay. When I put two exits in a building, I'm assuming people know the exits are there, and they will perhaps proportionally distribute them between them during a fire. Obviously, what that ignores is that in reality, just those two examples alone are not always going to hold true. So we know, for example, in buildings, if the alarm goes off, commonly people just look around. Even in buildings, say offices where the people have had training, often people delay. They perhaps unfamiliar with this situation, so they'll look around for information. And that's not how that assumption is built up. Similarly, with exit usage, if people use the same exit every day to come into a building and they're not even aware of another exit, then they're very unlikely to use that other exit. Again, this isn't captured in fire design guidance. So all of this means that it creates a bit of a gap in fire design guidance, the assumptions that are potentially there, and how people might actually behave in reality. And then the next step of that places onus on a fire engineer to think about these things and think, does it have an impact? Do I need to do anything differently?
Okay. And have you seen examples where good engineering design was undermined by unrealistic assumptions about people?
Yeah, I have. I've seen there's different examples. So first of all, there is sometimes a blind adherence to fire design guidance and the belief that compliance with fire design guidance equals safety. And we know that that's not always the case. The design guidance, I'd like to think of as fire design guidance, like approved document B, BS 9999, if we go abroad, NFPA 101, etc. These are a kind of a series of heuristics or rules which suggest that if you design your building like this, you're probably going to have something which looks safe enough. We're not optimizing for safety when we design buildings. If we were optimizing for safety, we'd never put people inside them. We would never have any combustible materials. We have to make them usable as well, which means we're making things safe enough. It's not optimizing for safety. Now, the issue is that if people blindly follow design guidance, you may end up with nonsensical designs or things which aren't fit for purpose, which provide a suitable level of fire safety. And this is why I don't like thinking about fire design guidance as a minimum level or a minimum standard, because that implies that if you achieve the minimum, that's good enough. And I'd say that sometimes you can do something totally different that's less than perhaps what's fire design guidance say, and that can still be fit for purpose. So I think I like to think of it like that. And similarly, in performance-based design in fire engineering, where we do deviate from fire design guidance, there's a whole host of ways that I've seen when I've reviewed third-party reviewed others' analysis, whereby they've made some assumptions which were particularly considered optimistic or neglectful of how people may actually behave. And this can be you can either reference past studies, or you can make certain unrealistic assumptions. For example, everyone responds once the alarm sounds. And also it's important to think about not just the assumptions, but what's the impact upon the design, because sometimes your assumptions don't align, but actually it has very negligible impact upon your design as well. So it's important to think about whether something occurs and what impact it has.
Recently, it was in the news in respect of the fire in Switzerland in a bar. One thing which always concerns me in respect to fire is when people are drinking alcohol and loud music in the event of a fire. When you've had a few drinks, you're not necessarily going to be thinking of, let's try and get out as fast as we can, or where's the exit? What things do you think went wrong with how that all came about? With, there's a few issues that were there with combustible materials used in the ceiling, but what could have been done differently which may have prevented that? Or in your view, what should change?
Yeah, I think there's a number of observations we can make from the event, and actually a number of common themes that we see in, say, nightclub fires that we have seen before and we know happen. Probably not in an amazing position, because I don't think we have all the facts in to make recommendations of what needs to change. But I can certainly talk about some of the things were observed. So, for example, there were anecdotal evidence that there were over 200 people within the nightclub, and most people were only familiar. Oh, sorry, most people, as I understand, tried to get out the way they came, which is common. We've seen that in a number of other nightclub fires. Now, if there was only a single exit in UK fire design guidance, we typically limit single exit occupancies or rooms to 60 people. So that would mean that perhaps that room that the nightclub is perhaps potentially has got more people than the exit can accommodate. Now, even if it has other exits to allow a greater number of people, if those people don't know where those exits are, they may not use them. And then the question is, well, just because you put exits somewhere or you put a sign above them, is that sufficient to permit greater numbers of people? And I think that doesn't get enough attention in fire design guidance. Putting exits in and the consideration, will people actually use them? I think there's an opportunity for research there as well, because it's not something which potentially can be easily condensed into a simple set of rules. But I definitely think it's something that general building design could benefit from. I think also there are some novel ignition sources that, from the videos, looked like sparklers. They were being held in like champagne bottles. And couple that with the foam ceiling, that's obviously not a great combination. And we've seen at the station nightclub fire, whereby there were indoor pyrotechnics setting fire to the ceiling as well. So that would seem an interesting thing to potentially consider prohibiting, if not already. And if it is prohibited, then the question is, why isn't it being forced? So that would be something worth looking at. As you mentioned before, in nightclubs, people are commonly intoxicated. It's also, so that means that people may be slower in identifying that there is something which is wrong. They may be potentially slower in moving, maybe. Their decision making may be impaired. Again, all of which can delay things. It can also potentially impact people's decision whether they, choose to fight a fire, potentially. Because obviously we're in a very small environment and lots of people. When something like a fire happens, it's obviously an unfamiliar environment to most people. They've never experienced a fire before. And commonly, when we experience the unfamiliar, we haven't got any past experience to draw from to tell us what to do. So there's a concept of social proof, whereby we look for what other people around us are doing to decide or validate what is the correct course of action. So if a lot of people just carry on looking at the fire, don't do anything, you're more likely to do the same. And it's very hard to break out of that social proof influence.
So that brings us to evacuation modeling then, because obviously that's got a huge part to play in how people evacuate. But firstly, when there's a building that is not yet built, during design phase, you run an evacuation model. So evacuation modeling is often seen as a definitive answer rather than a tool. So in Europe, how should designers, regulators, and inspectors really be using these models?
I think it's a great question. I think probably the first thing to say is that the vast majority of buildings, I would, finger in the air, anecdotally say 90+%, 95+% don't use evacuation modeling. They don't use egress hand calculations. They are using fire design guidance compliance as a benchmark for safety. And that kind of has it implied levels of safety in the sense that I've got this many exits, this number of people. I'm not explicitly showing someone it's okay that people can get out, but I'm, assuming I meet these rules, it should be okay. Evacuation modeling, or if I do evacuation hand calcs, is doing a calculation showing people can go from one area to another and physically showing what's happening. I think in terms of, and like you've said, I think the way we frame and historically have framed the use of evacuation models is potentially either unclear or potentially even incorrect. Like you've said, some people use evacuation models and they'll say, look, this shows everybody will get out before a fire causes untenable conditions. And that this design is safe because the model shows it so. And I think there's a fundamental issue here because unlike other forms of engineering, human behavior is incredibly broad and incredibly diverse. And we don't know the initial conditions prior to a real fire in the future. And we don't know people's past experience. And because of this, any model we run, we need to temper the levels of confidence we have in our models because we don't know these factors before an actual fire. So what I prefer to frame evacuation modeling as is they're not crystal balls for predicting the future. They're virtual tools for stress testing your design as an explorative tool to show where vulnerabilities exist, where congestion may happen, where people may have problems and where maybe they benefit from either, additional exits or staff procedures and things like that. So I prefer to think of these as virtual tools to assess design and help identify vulnerabilities rather than predictive tools of what's going to happen in the future.
So would you say they are? You wouldn't call them, for example, absolute truth reference, but an informed estimate, let's say.
Yeah, I would say that we're not dealing with a one solution problem. We're not designing for one fire when we design buildings. We have to assess a broad range of fires and similarly a broad range of human behaviors. So when we're painting a picture when we're doing fire and evacuation modeling of things that could happen and what does that tell me about how the design might behave? And I would like to frame them more as an explorative tools rather than absolutes of saying this is safe because my modeling shows it so.
And we're building control professionals, myself and Jack, we're registered building inspectors, and we sometimes receive evacuation modeling as part of a submitted fire strategy, for example. What are common questions that you've received from building control professionals when you've submitted an evacuation model before as part of a fire strategy?
Yeah, I mean, there are loads, and it's really varied because sometimes building control, in most of my experience, building control will employ a third party to review the fire and evacuation model results, and therefore it depends who they ask. Normally, another fire engineer who has hopefully some experience in evacuation modeling. I have had experience where his experience was in fire modeling, CFD modeling, and he thought, oh, I like human behavior. I'm really interested. So I thought I'd be the reviewer for your evacuation model. But he didn't actually have any experience in human behavior and
Okay.
evacuation, or very little in evacuation modeling. And I think this highlights a bit of a concern I have is that evacuation modeling is quite an accessible subject because we're all humans. When I see people running around in a model, I can understand that's what's happening. And some of the models are really easy to use setup models. So it becomes easy to be able to set up models, to run models, but maybe not be fully aware of all the nuances of human behavior. And that can create the illusion that someone is competent to be a reviewer. But in terms of some of the questions,
So
I've had.
are we right to assume that not every fire engineer is knowledgeable enough in certain type of modeling, for example? Like they could be
Absolutely.
experts in CFD, but they are not as experts in evacuation modeling as they are in CFD. Is that a right assumption or a right statement to say?
Absolutely. Fire engineering is incredibly broad because we have to be able to talk to all these other engineers, mechanical, structural, think about human behavior, think about fire and smoke dynamics. So I would say a lot of fire engineers develop base level knowledge, but often end up specializing sometimes. And what this means is there's an asymmetry in their expertise. And for me, I've got a lot more knowledge in human behavior than some of other domains. Um, the challenge is that because there are certain domains where if you don't have a certain level of knowledge, you'll very much struggle to talk about it. If you're structural fire engineering, if you don't have some base level background in physics and structural design, it's going to be quite hard for you to really do some analysis in there. But absolutely, competency and modeling is, unfortunately, it's not well documented. What competency do we require for modelers beyond saying, have you worked on these types of projects before? It's quite a blunt tool in that sense.
You touched on some of the research that you've been doing as part of your works as a fire engineer. In respect of high-rise evacuation using lifts, why is lift evacuation such a complex and sensitive topic?
It's a really interesting question. And I should caveat that my PhD was mainly involved in full building evacuation. Like, how can we get everyone out as quickly as possible compared to just stairs alone? It's somewhat confounding me that the topic of using lifts for evacuation has been discussed for over 100 years. There are reported accounts from early NFPA meetings in the US having explicit conversations about why don't we use lifts to evacuate. The only reason we can have tall buildings is because lifts allow people to get higher up. They don't need to walk upstairs. And we've been having conversations for over 100 years about lift evacuation. Now, largely, they've been confined to very, very tall buildings where people have decided, yeah, you can use a lift in that situation. But they haven't been more commonly adopted. And I think it's only in more recent times, and I say recent, I mean the last maybe few decades, where more serious conversations have been had. And I think it's perhaps fueled by the fact that we have maybe an aging population where more people perhaps are older, and as you get older, if people are living longer, they're becoming older in our buildings, and they're more likely to be disabled, which means there's a higher potential proportion of people that can't use the stairs. And this has created an impetus to go, well, what can we do about it? And the obvious thing is use lifts. I think certainly when we think about World Trade Center 9/11 attacks, a lot of people use lifts to evacuate. If people didn't use lifts, there would be a far higher casualty rate because the stairs would be overloaded. And there are a lot of instances where people were told during training in the World Trade Center 9/11 attacks, I know I shouldn't use a lift, but I'm going to use it anyway because I just need to get out. And I think there have been a few other instances which have sort of exemplified potential benefits of lifts, but there have also been accounts where people have tried to use a lift and they've died using it. And perhaps the lift has opened up on a fire floor. That certainly happened in Grenfell and a number of other fires as well. So I think this is promoted. We know how to design lifts to be able to operate and when perhaps we should operate them during fires. So I'm surprised it hasn't been adopted more. I think certainly post Grenfell and in the UK, we've got BS 991 2024, which mandates essentially where we have a protected stair, you need to put an evacuation lift. I think that's a great first start because it's making evacuation lifts the default, not an added. It's making it a default, which I think will help the fire strategies we develop for residential buildings more scalable so that they'll be able to accommodate older, less mobile people in the future.
Do you think there are still some misconceptions about the use of lift in fire scenarios, which aren't really going to be something that's going to be a problem?
Yeah, there's certainly some things that I've been thinking about which I think wouldn't be too hard to test through research projects. So, for example, a common thing you may hear is that we put evacuation lifts in, but people have been told classically not to use lifts, and we're going to really struggle to get people to use lifts during a fire. I think, and I don't have data to support this might be a bit of a myth. I think people use lifts every day. And all we're asking for is during a certain incident, use it one more time. And we know that people will move towards the familiar. We've seen a number of past fires where people have decided, I'm going to use a lift. I know I shouldn't, but it's okay. I just need to get out. We've had it happening. It happened in Grenfell. People attempted to use lifts to evacuate. So I think the biggest challenge we will have is not that there's this belief that people have been told not to use lifts and they need to be convinced in some way. I don't think that will be a problem. I think a bigger problem we'll have is that if lifts are available, if we require only disabled people to use the lifts and everyone else to use the stairs, I think a bigger problem we'll have is persuading people who can use the stairs but use the lift every day for normal operation to persuade them, don't get in that lift that you normally use every day, go down the stairs. I think that's perhaps a bigger issue we might be facing, because if everyone starts using a lift, it means disabled people who can't use the stairs are going to be delayed being able to get out the building.
Yeah, do you think it's a bit of a trust issue on what people have always thought, that never go in the lift in a fire, to now it can be used?
I don't think some of the research I originally did would ask people, if you were told it was okay to use a lift, would you use it? Large proportions said they would be prepared to use a lift. And like I said, if it's a building you're familiar with and you perhaps use regularly, you're just asking them to use a means of escape that they normally use in normal operation. So I'm not sure, unless people are exposed to certain incidents where that gives them a reason not to use a lift. So, for example, certainly in Grenfell, there was reports of they were concerned lifts often broke down, and that gave people pause for thought, I think, in the perceptions of the reliability of the lifts. I think those type of situations definitely need consideration, but generally, I'm not sure that's going to be as big a problem. I think it certainly warrants further research, but I think a bigger issue is going to be persuading people who can use the stairs not to use the lift.
This episode is sponsored by Plan Checker. Across building control and the wider construction sector, one issue keeps coming up: capacity. The work is there, the responsibility is huge, and the pressure keeps increasing. Plan Checker was built to help bridge that gap by making it easier to access independent, appropriately qualified professionals when support is genuinely needed. Whether that's for plan reviews, consultancy input, or specialist advice. It doesn't change statutory responsibility, and it doesn't interfere with regulatory routes. It simply helps people find expertise without relying on informal networks or last-minute phone calls. If you want to see how that works in practice, visit planchecker.co.uk. Michael, human behavior, decision-making and delay. This is very, how do I put that? One thing that often surprises people in evacuation is evacuation delay. From your research in human behavior, why don't occupants move immediately when an alarm sounds? Some people sometimes think, no, that's a false alarm. You know, I've had it. I've had that experience. Think just before Christmas, I was spending a night in a hotel, and I was having a meeting online with one of my colleagues, and the, the alarm sound. It was like 10 a.m. in the morning. And my immediate reaction wasn't to go to the door. My immediate reaction is to get my bag and then wait. I delayed for a second. I was like, is this real? Is this a test? So why does that happen from your research?
I mean, there's been a lot of research looking at pre-evacuation behavior. And probably for me, what's surprising is that people are still surprised people don't start evacuating. That's the surprise for me, because there's a lot of amazing research by various other people in the field looking at this topic. And to unpack a few key things. One is, when alarm goes off, if it's just a sounder, most people either haven't heard a sounder before, perhaps in the hotel, and they're not sure, even if they've heard it before, what to do. So it's uncertainty. And like we've said, during uncertain situations, what do people do? Well, they want to reduce uncertainty. So they might look to what other people are doing. If you're on your own, you might think, well, it could be a drill. So I'm going to wait a little while, perhaps. These are potential things. On top of this, you're doing something already. You're doing a task in the building. You run a meeting. You're having a meal you're having perhaps on a date, or you're watching a movie. All of those things are what you want to be doing, and
Sure.
that's called something we call pre-task commitment. So you're committed to doing something and you want to do it. If you're at a nightclub, you want to carry on dancing, you want to carry on drinking with your friends. You've perhaps paid a lot of money to go somewhere. I don't want to leave that's going to be absolute waste. So that might color your interpretation of the information that is being presented to you. You don't want to find a reason to leave. And especially if other people aren't doing it, that gives you confidence that, oh, perhaps it's okay. So the pre-task commitment is really important. What you're doing, how committed you are, how you assess those cues, what other people are doing. And I think a lot of this doesn't really get the attention or the appreciation it deserves when we're designing buildings. A lot of professionals, fire engineers, or perhaps even your building control go, why don't people leave? So, well, perhaps the question should be, why should they leave? They've got a load of other stuff they want to be doing.
So would you say that's the most common reason people underestimate evacuation risk? Is the reasons that you've just mentioned now?
Yeah, I mean, we did a paper on cognitive biases, which is all about biased decision making in human behavior and fire. And the crux of that was, why do people make mistakes in decision making during fire evacuations? And one of them, which I think was originally developed by Erica Kuligowski at NIST, was this concept of optimism bias or normalcy bias. We assume things aren't as bad as they appear, and we underappreciate the risk. So in the nightclub fire in Switzerland recently, people didn't appreciate how quickly a fire could spread. They don't appreciate the toxic fumes that could be given off by burning foam. So they underappreciated it, and that can cause delay because it colors your perception of risk, and you make you think that things aren't as bad as they seem.
So you would say that obviously group behavior and social cues or authority within that space have an effect on evacuation decision then?
Definitely, absolutely.
Okay.
I think, places like nightclubs maybe there's a few things that they may consider, maybe warrant consideration in design. So if your smoke alarm goes off, cutting out, putting on the lights, turning off the music, breaking people's whatever they're doing, that decision chain. Tell staff to start telling people what to do. They've done studies whereby they've compared alarm sounders with PA systems telling people what to do. And they found that the PA system where people were told, this is a real fire, please get out, people responded much quicker because you remove that ambiguity of just a sound happening to someone saying, this is what you need to do.
With some of the development and changes of guidance documents, we've had British standards being updated. With your involvement in some of these developments, how well do current standards capture the reality of human behaviour in fire?
So I've been involved in a few guidance documents, SFP handbook, the evacuation modelling chapter, the SFB guide to human behaviour, and it was more recently that I've joined some of the British standards committees. I would say currently, and I guess the key ones when we think about human behaviour are going to be in the UK. It would be perhaps BS 9999, 9991, and BS the British standard of the number escapes me for looking at human behaviour and evacuation modelling. So I would say there is a lot of things which I think are lacking at the moment in the design guidance, like 9999, 9991. Now, one of the challenges is that they try to create these simplified rules of thumb. If this, do this. And it's hard to do that with human behavior, let alone it's hard to empirically do that. Where's the evidence to suggest a given rule? And I think that's perhaps been one of the challenges. A lot of research in human behavior in fire kind of feeds into the modeling side of things, which, as I mentioned earlier, only represents a tiny portion of the building designs we work on. Most building designs are just built according to fire design guidance. I'd say there's a lot of room for improvement in what's being done in fire design guidance. I think it needs research as well. I think it needs research with a specific remit to develop heuristics which are empirically based, so that we can remove that concept of magic numbers whereby there's a width factor per person per millimeter, like that nobody knows where it comes from. I think having that empirical basis for the numbers will give people confidence where it comes from, and also allow people to decide, is that appropriate for my building? And if not, I can then decide what else to do, rather than just, magic numbers.
How should practitioners balance compliance with standards against professional judgment and context?
What do you mean by balance?
To try and strike the right approach, not just put something in for the sake of putting in because that's what's in the guidance.
Got it. I think what you're asking relies on the competency of in this case, perhaps the practitioner, to decide, is this fit for purpose? And to do that, you need to think about how people might behave. And it may be a case of just thinking about what people might do. And in order to be able to accurately think about some of the things people might do, you need to be aware of some of the research. And that's for people, but also it's for fire and smoke dynamics as well. Thinking about where fires might happen, how might they impact, and you don't need models to do that. You can just, if you've got some level of background knowledge, you can use informed judgment. I would say that's the onus on every practitioner to do that, and then they can decide, is this guidance fit for purpose? So I would understand, that's in perhaps a rose-tinted world that you can do that for every fire, aspect of fire design guidance. But the reality is, often fire engineers, it's assumed they're the default things you follow, and if you can't follow it, then okay, can we do some analysis?
Yeah, so it's not too dissimilar to likes of being a registered building inspector. With you can work on certain projects. With the fire engineering, that looks as though it may be taking on a similar approach with competency, where we can work on certain types of building from classes 2A to F, and then there's higher rise buildings. With fire engineering, do you think that's going to be down the same path where certain individuals will have to prove competence on certain types of buildings, and they should really only be making decisions on those types and do other works under supervision from a suitably competent fire engineer? Or
That
Yeah,
ties a lot with what you just said, Michael, before about some fire engineers are competent in certain type of modeling than others. So what's your thoughts on fire engineers being subject to the same kind of competency assessments and classification like registered building inspectors have gone through, or building control surveyors as they were called in the past, have gone through to become a protected title and registered under certain classes to prove certain competencies? And what's your thoughts on that?
I think ultimately it's a good thing, because it will raise the standard. I think. I think it's a little bit of a blunt tool to perhaps addressing changes in either fire design guidance or the way in which we're involved in the design process itself, which I think could be worth consider, how we're engaged, how we engage with other people. I also think the topic of competency can't be talked about in any level of detail until we define what is the scope of a fire engineer in a building design process. I know the FIA have started looking at this with a kind of matrix, but I don't think, if we don't talk about the scope of what what subjects a fire engineer should know about and the level of detail, then we can't say, how are you competent in a given area? Competency has to be tied to scope and level of detail. And then from that, I think when you're working on building design, what should a fire engineer be doing? Where does a fire engineer, develop strategic level information versus when does a specialist designer take over that and start developing information? Those demarcations between where do we take it to, and then detailed design, I think need to be defined. At the moment, it's not, and you know, it can be that There's uncertainty and disagreement about what's the scope and remit of fire engineers. There could be design teams where they'll just send you every drawing they've got and say you need to check it. Conversely, there are other design teams that say, right, we'll follow this, and the level of reviewing drawings and things is less. I think there's no explicit defined guidance, which I think needs to be done first before we can talk about competency in a meaningful manner.
Education, culture, and skills gap. You teach and lecture internationally. Do you think enough emphasis is placed on human behavior in fire within engineering and construction education? Or it's not given the appropriate weight?
I think I have taught abroad because I used to live in China, and I have guest lectured at certain universities, and I, a visiting lecturer at Birmingham City University at the moment. I would take a step back and go so far as to say there's not enough fire engineering programs at universities. You look at the UK, which, if you look at the history of fire engineering, between, the UK, bits of Europe, and the US, like UK has a real rich heritage of pioneering fire engineering research, but only a tiny number of academic institutions formally teach the topic. Some only teach a module, some only do a master's degree, and it's always surprised me that there's not more universities teaching fire engineering. So that's one topic. And I know at the UK, universities are going through a tough time at the moment with, impacts of funding, things like that. But I've always remember, I can't remember who said it, but a professor said that fire engineering is one of the most, you're guaranteed a job at the end of a fire engineering degree because so few fire engineers. And it always amazed me that there just doesn't feed into more courses being developed. So, and an extension of that is teaching human behavior in fire. So I would say it's a more broader issue that we need more university courses to teach people about fire engineering, and also perhaps further downstream, teaching children that this is a real career and a real profession that they can have a career in, so that, perhaps one day they're dreaming of being a fire engineer, like they do about dreaming being astronauts and pilots and what have you.
If
Or
this
building control
improvement's happening,
surveyors.
yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
So Michael, if this educational improvement in this area happened, what difference would you think it would make in the fire safety outcome?
Well, it would certainly mean, at the very least, it should increase the numbers. But just having more people doesn't mean outcomes will change. So the devil is in the detail.
Yes.
So, and I think if you get 100 bad courses, that doesn't mean suddenly things are going to get better. So I think one of the important things on the courses is to teach about subject matters, structural response to fire, how people behave in fires, but then also very practically based things that real world fire engineers use, and trying to instill a sense of pride and obligation of, we are trying to work with design teams to make buildings safer during fires, and then cultivate, a good attitude. And then hopefully we will end up with better processes that increase the likelihood of safer designs.
Well, this is a bit of just a question which has just come straight to my head. Would you ever consider developing the course?
So I've been involved in a developing, or people have approached me and some other people about developing courses. I was involved actually in some of the stuff with Birmingham City University as well in the early days, and I sometimes guest lecture at universities. Love to get involved in developing courses. Often, a lot of the small number of courses that we have, they're really good. If you look at University of Lancashire, University of Edinburgh, Birmingham City University, they're really good at engaging with people to get practical insights on courses. I think one of the biggest issues we have is that the universities don't do fire engineering, aren't developing courses. And maybe a better question would be, why aren't they? And
maybe they'll approach you after that podcast if some of them listen to it.
I'm more than happy to come and give guest lectures anywhere. One of the challenges you might say is that if you're a fire engineer, maybe the pay structure for fire engineers The trajectory of fire engineer salaries and income is perhaps higher than someone who works in academia. That's potentially a genuine concern. I know that certain realms of the fire service may have some of the challenges as well. Consulting is paid more, and that means that perhaps it perhaps challenges how long people stay in certain fields. So maybe that's the case, but I think it's maybe one thing to do is to have the government involvement to have some taps on shoulders of deans at universities. Say, why aren't you doing you've got world leading, I don't know, electrical mechanical engineering department. Why don't you have fire? And there's certainly loads of people, lots of practicing fire engineers that do guest lecture, really smart people that would happily help inform development of a course. So yeah, like I said, I know universities at the moment are going through a tough time with budgets, redundancies, etc., but this would seem like an obvious one because there's so much need for it.
Well, there's been a lot of government funding for the LABC trainees. It would make sense to also provide some funding for the training of fire engineers. There's a lot of trainee building control surveyors. It would be prudent to have some trainee fire engineers and start getting that rolled out as well. That's equally as important as building control. If we're going to be working hand in hand in certain types of projects, it would make sense to build up the industry on all avenues.
I think exchange programs as well between maybe fire engineer, building control, fire engineers, and the fire service as well. Perhaps in fire engineering teams, there's a lot of potential benefits. I think because if you're in you're where you sit within the approvals process will influence what you see and how you see things. Whereas if you did some exchange programs, I think that could be quite useful to sort of give different perspectives of certain things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd definitely put my hand up if someone said, would you like to go out with fire engineers and spend some time with them and understand their thought process? I think that type of information you'd get is invaluable. You'd absolutely definitely make sense. One question that I do have in respect of evacuation modelling evolving with better data and computing power, do you think that's going to happen and it's going to make things a bit easier, or do you think AI can assist in some of these tools?
I don't know. I do know that just collecting more data doesn't mean your model's accuracy gets any better. I do think that the way current evacuation models work is very much on a rule-based system or probabilistic rule-based system. If this, do this, or have a probability of doing this. It's kind of like a Monte Carlo simulation. I think we do need more research in understanding how people make decisions as a precursor for developing better models. I'm not sure we're ever going to be having a model that predicts what a one person or a group of people will do. I think we do need better guidance on framing evacuation models as tools, virtual stress testing sandboxes for assessing performance and then giving indications of vulnerabilities. I think that's an avenue worth framing. And it goes against people's perceptions of things like an ASET RSET. Like ASET is people can get out before untenable conditions occur. This time is less than this time with a safety factor. It's okay. That's the wrong narrative, I think, about when we use evacuation and fire models. I think the narrative should be more along the lines of we've explored these scenarios. This suggests there are certain vulnerabilities where crowding occurs and things like that, and we're going to take that and do something with it. And given these assumptions about fire, this suggests that people have, are able to get out in a reasonable amount of time in these scenarios. It doesn't mean the design is always safe. You could have fires in any of these buildings which weren't modeled in the same way you modeled them, and then people potentially could die. So I think it's good to reframing a bit about the analysis of them, I think is that's doable. I can see in terms of the models and AI. I'm not sure. I think sometimes AI is used as a bit of a fancy tool for some people to get research funding and not solve a real world problem, but they solve a problem which doesn't exist. I've replaced the need for my evacuation model with an AI engine. The problem with AI, AI technology is often it's a black box and you put in input parameters and something comes out based on some training data. And an issue we have in most models is validation verification is important. We need to know what's happening underneath the hood to have confidence why it's getting certain results out. With AI, if it's this black box, we don't know why it's producing the results, then to what level should we have confidence in it? And that creates a big question mark. And I think when you're dealing with people's safety, you can't only rely on that. I'm an advocate of using AI in a suggestive nature, but it can't be used as in isolation as a decision-making tool.
Michael, it certainly was a very interesting conversation with yourself, and I'm sure a lot of listeners would agree to that. Before we go to the closing of this interesting conversation, if there is one message you'd want designers, regulators, and building control professionals to take away about human behavior in fire, what would it be?
Wow. There's loads. You know,
That one that comes straight to your head, the one message that you always sit down with yourself and say, I really want those people to understand, to take this about human behavior in fire. What's the one thing that really you want to send out there and have those people really know about it from your own experience, research, knowledge, everything?
Well, I wish I had something really profound up my sleeve, but just off the bat, I would say be curious about compliant designs. Don't comply and then carry on thinking. Be curious about, even my design is compliant, which a lot of fire engineers are trying to achieve. Just still think about how people might actually behave given my design. Is there anything which sometimes it's low hanging fruit that can be changed? It costs almost nothing to do. Sometimes it's a case of this doesn't make sense. This makes no sense. And this is the reason why it may be compliant with design guidance, but it doesn't make sense. And then be curious and be courageous in raising it with your design team. When someone says it's already complies, why do we need to do X, Y, Z? Be courageous in saying why.
Challenge then.
I would say challenge and have courage, because it does take courage to say, even though it's compliant, you probably need to do something here, and this is why.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Michael, we both really appreciate you taking the time out to speak with us. Obviously, we're quite a new podcast, so to have someone like yourself take the time to speak with us, it's greatly appreciated, and we hope you've enjoyed being on the podcast.
I've very much enjoyed it. It's really interesting, just, bouncing around ideas with you guys, and just, communicating, writing down things helps formulate your own thinking as well. So it very much is fed back into my own thinking as well. So thank you very much. I think it's a great thing you guys are doing. So good luck.
Thank you, Michael. Much appreciated. And hopefully our listeners will enjoy it as much as we did. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
This episode of Behind the Regs is sponsored by Plan Checker. Plan Checker is a UK-based digital platform designed to connect clients with verified building control and construction professionals, making it easier to find the right expertise at the right time for the right job. It doesn't replace building control bodies, and it doesn't carry out restricted activities or function. It simply creates clearer, more transparent access to the professionals working across the industry. If you're a professional, a client, or part of the wider built environment sector, you can learn more or sign up at planchecker.co.uk.